Hi, let's talk about sentence structure now. We've been building to understanding comprehension by talking about word recognition and auditory recognition, written and hearing sounds. But now let's get into building entire sentences. So we just finished all this word processing. So the question here really is, what happens when we try and string them together? So how do we create a comprehensive picture of what we're reading? And we'll get into how people structure their reading mostly in this section, and talk about comprehension in the next section. So a lot of this depends on thematic roles. So thematic roles is who is doing what to whom. So actors and in the sentence, the direct objects in the sentence, verbs. And so the goal of really sentences is to put things into these roles. Who's the actor, what action are they doing, and what's being acted upon. So we have to kind of remember that as we go through this section. And really it's focused on the verbs. So verbs determine who can act and who can do what. And so verbs become sort of an important component, especially when we talk about ambiguity, on how our brains process these kinds of sentences. Okay. So really a lot of this is going to talk about parse trees. Parse trees we've talked about before, but they're this idea that we break things down into their constituents, in this case, which are words and not phonemes. So we've got the actor of the sentence, the dog, a verb in the sentence, bit, the direct object, the boy, and sort of indirect on the porch. So we can break those down into articles, or determinants, nouns, verbs, prepositions. And so it really becomes important, this verb, because it determines what can happen, who can do the biting. So you couldn't say the leaf bit the boy, because that would not make semantic sense, although syntactically that noun would be correct. So parsing is a way that we analyze that grammatical structure of a sentence and assign things into roles. So parsing is kind of a term that covers both the breakdown of the sentence but into a semantic structure. So it's an understanding of syntax that leads to semantics. And we'll get into how those two either are separate things or they interact. And that's going to be the main component of this lecture, is getting into how we parse and how semantics and syntax interacts. So to do parsing, we first have to figure out what each word technically is: noun, verb, article, preposition. So is it a function word or a content word? We do break things into phrases. Clauses are very important in reading. We found the subject and the verb, and really English is focused on word order. So word order becomes especially important for meaning, but also for sentence structure. So, two big types of models that we'll go through this whole section. The models are either autonomous, so syntax only influences syntax, it's separate from semantics, so each one has their own autonomy, hence the name. Syntax is one thing, semantics is another, and they're separate things. And then the interaction models, where we have syntax and semantics interacting to influence this parsing process. So we will talk about whether or not each one is supported throughout the rest of the lecture. Okay. There's also one-stage models. So one-stage models are where syntax and semantics are used all in one go at the same time, or two-stage models where syntax is first and then semantics. And those can either be autonomous or interactive in either one stage or two. So the way that people study this is really through ambiguity. Parsing normal sentences occurs so quickly and is kind of dry and boring, so it's much easier to trick people or to confuse them, because then you can slow them down long enough you can see what happens when people parse. So parsing unexpected things allows us to study parsing better. And so just some kind of funny headlines. I got them from this link. Police see orange, attackers, enraged cow enters farmer with axe. So just kind of these there's tons of these examples of newspaper titles or even articles online or titles that are sort of ambiguous, because they're shortened and you're not really sure what happened. And so that sort of ambiguity really helps us understand sentence processing. Okay. So ambiguity is a real big strain on your processing system, and that really allows us to understand it better, especially when you study it with eye tracking, like we talked about in the very beginning of the semester, so you can see where people's eyes are going, at what point it becomes so ambiguous they have to back up. So the models for ambiguity are types of the either autonomous or interactive models, or in a one-stage or a two-stage model. So these are kind of those ideas combined into a model. So a serial autonomous model is creating a parse tree with only syntax and then adding semantics. So serial being one at a time, this would be a two-stage model. If that syntax does not work, you will go backwards and recreate the tree. This is the parse tree. Okay. A parallel autonomous model means we're creating all possible syntactic representations at once. So all of the possible ways the sentence could be parsed or broken down are created at one time, and then we choose the one that makes the most sense. So parallel meaning we're getting all the possible combinations, serial meaning one option at a time. Interactive models for this say that semantics and syntax are used together interactively to create the most plausible parse tree available. Okay. So how do we know which one is true? Is it serial, is it parallel, or is it interactive? And the way people study this is garden path sentences. Garden path sentences lead you astray, lead you down the garden path the wrong way, so that you have to go back and reprocess. So we can tell, given different types of studies, how, if they're doing all the possible models, because then processing would be not too hard, because I have that model already in my brain. It's just not maybe the most popular one at first. Is it one model at a time, which means to be really slow, or is it this interactive component? Okay. And it really uses a lot of participles. And what those do is they're verb phrases where the verb is turned into an adjective. So I've taken what's normally frequency-wise a verb, changed it into an adjective. Participles are really useful because the first interpretation is verb, so it creates this ambiguous situation. Okay, so here's an example of some garden paths. The old men, the boats. So you have to stop and think, man is not a noun there. Man is a verb. The most common interpretation of man, though, is for a noun. So at first it appears there's no verb in this sentence. And so you hit the old man, you create a noun phrase for that, because normally this would be article, adjective, noun. And then you hit the second phrase, the boats, and you don't have a verb. So you'd have to go back and back up and figure out which one is the verb. The horse raced past the barn fell. This is a very famous sentence. What happens is the horse raced past the barn is very easy parse tree to create until you get to the second verb. And you're not sure what to do with that verb. Do you attach it to the closest noun, which is called minimal attachment, sometimes called late closure, depending on which theory we're talking about. Or do you go back and figure out it's the horse, the foot is falling. Race past the barn is an embedded clause. So the reason that most garden paths are confusing is because they use two different things. One is called a reduced relative, and that's where you take a relative clause and you reduce it. You don't need this extra verb, but you are removing a pronoun and a that, a pronoun and the word was. So if I said the horse was raced past the barn, okay, I don't need the was, but it implies that maybe horse is, it helps disambiguate the sentence, sorry. And then also a complementizer. Usually these are words like that help you indicate that there's a subordinate clause coming. So a clause, the horse that was raced past the barn fell. And that, adding both the reduced relative and, or changing it from a reduced relative and adding the complementizer makes it no longer ambiguous. Because the that was indicates a clause here, and now I'm waiting for the real verb. So you're sort of paused and waiting for the verb. So things that help you when you're reading garden paths are commas, or if you hear it aloud with normal speech pauses, which imply commas. Most people consider these reduced clauses sort of implausible. You don't think the sentence is syntactically correct because they don't really occur very often. Most people don't say things this way. They include that complementizer as a cue for you. Okay. And then the cute bunny on here. Okay. So we're going to get into early and late process parsing and use some Chomsky theory, which we haven't done too much this semester, and talk about kind of his ideas for how we parsed sentences, getting back into surface and deep structure. So what Chomsky's arguments were for generative grammar, that to understand or to parse sentences, we really had to pull up what was called their deep structure or their semantic meaning. And the way that you did this was by doing transformations. So one issue with transformations is that the more complicated a syntax in a sentence got, the more transformations you would need to understand the deep structure. So complexity of a syntax predicts longer processing times because you would need to transform it more to understand that deep structure. He also argued for autonomous models where syntax and semantics were separate things. So transformations, what are these? They're obligatory. They're required for your sentence to be grammatical. So you have to make sure the subject and the verb match. You have to make sure tenses match. You would make sure that common pronouns would match, that sort of thing. Then there are some optional processes, things that really aren't required for processing, like making things into passive voice. Kernel sentences are active, affirmative, declarative forms of English where all of the obligatory transformations have occurred. And that just sounds very formal, but basically what it's saying is that sentences in active voice that are declarative, that sort of are fact-based, with those transformations are the easiest to read because they are the most direct. They're a parse tree that you would expect. It's a noun phrase, verb phrase, direct objects. And there's research that supports that sentences that require more transformations take you longer to process that aren't these kernel sentences. But there's a lot of problems with this transformational grammar idea. And the main one is the conceptualization of complex syntax. So if syntax is complex, of course it takes you longer to process because it's more complex. So saying that it's more complex, therefore it has more transformations, therefore it has more processing, sort of is that transformation piece even necessary? It's more complex, therefore more processing. It also tends to have more words. And there's some research on reversible versus irreversible passive voice that does not support this theory. So reversible passive voice is where you can reverse the actor and the direct object in the sentence, and it's still grammatically or semantically correct. So the ghost was chased by the robot is a sentence that, sort of holding all things relative is plausible. The robot was chased by the ghost, also plausible. So that is a reversive passive voice. I've changed ghost and robot, the nouns in the sentence, both still plausible. Okay. Irreversible passives are ones where you change the nouns in the sentence and they aren't plausible. So the flowers were watered by the robot. All right, I need a robot watering my flowers because it's so hot. But the robot was watered by the flowers is semantically incorrect, because flowers don't tend to water robots, unless I guess we're reading sci-fi. So this reversion is not semantically correct. Syntactically, it is correct, but semantically, it doesn't make sense. Okay. You do take longer to read reversible sentences because you're transforming it from passive voice to active voice. So you would think that irreversible sentences should show that same effect because it still requires a transformation. That's what the theory would predict, but they actually don't show that effect because your brain just sort of goes, it's not plausible, it moves on. So the autonomy of syntax is broken. It interacts with semantics to parse the sentence, and so we shouldn't see this effect, but we do, so that does not support transformational grammar. And so the main idea is that syntax proposes a structure, semantics dispose a structure. So we'll build our parse tree based on syntax and then go back when the semantics doesn't make sense, or stop when semantics doesn't make sense. And so they might be mildly separate things, but they clearly interact with each other. So getting into some later research on parsing. Now this isn't later like parsing part 1, parsing part 2. This is parsing research-wise later in the research field. People really were interested in more of unit size. Sentences are major processing units, but we also look at clauses. And so there's some research, I think it's Jarvella, that shows that after a sentence boundary, you forget what words were even there. So as you're reading along, you hit a sentence end, you'll consolidate all of that information into your mental model of what is happening, and then you just forget the words. You don't need them anymore. And people will remember only the gist of what happened. Clauses are also very important. And clauses are related words that have a subject and a verb, and we actually process usually in clause format if it's complex, and sentence format if it's simpler. So there's also a clause boundary. So if you stop someone at the end of a clause and ask them what words they had just read, they'll remember the current clause but nothing before it. If you wait till the end of the sentence, they'll actually forget the whole entire sentence. We do see that I fixations are longest at the end of each clause because you're incorporating it into the structure that you have. So clauses are very important as well as entire sentences, mostly because clauses are kind of mini sentences. Okay. So some interesting research using clicks, believe it or not. So what they did was they had a dichotic listening task where in one ear they were playing the sentence, in the right ear they were playing some clicks. The clicks were in the middle of a clause, but they asked people to report at which word did you hear the click. And what they actually find is that people hear they say they hear the click at the end of the clause. So even though the researchers know it's in the middle of the clause, because of the way we parse, we hit the end of the clause and we think the click is there. Then they tried it again, but they didn't actually play any clicks, and they told people they were going to subliminally, blah, 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 that was awkward, subliminally hear these clicks, so they thought. And so they reported hearing the clicks in the same places, at the ends of clauses and the ends of sentences. So these studies really indicate that sentences and clauses are really important. These are boundaries at which we're processing and creating these parsing trees. Okay. But just because nothing in life is that simple, we do get some word interactions. So you still see some effect of individual words and not just sort of the whole clause put together. So if you gave people a study, Christina thought the book was boring, period, that's a sentence, we're done. And then you get, he was sure to return it to the library. What happens is that you get these big spikes in EEG processing and very long looks, if we're talking about fixations at the word he, because the word he does not match the incorporation of Christina from the previous sentence. So there is this sort of interaction effect. So if we were only building by sentence or by clause, you would expect the end of the sentence to be important. So this sentence and this sentence trying to smush them together. But that individual word is such a big cue that people look at it for a really long time. / we get really big spikes in their EEGs. So eye tracking studies also show these word effects. So if you give people the sentence, well, the woman will spread the butter, at the word spread, they'll start looking at a picture of bread. If you instead say the woman will slide the butter, they'll look at the man in the scene rather than the bread in the scene, because you're assuming she's going to slide it across the table. So at the word spread, it indicates what to look at, and at the word slide. So those individual words, and not at the end of the clause, are causing these changes in our reactions. So getting into sort of how we process in parsing. So there's 7 rules of parsing, basic parsing, and we'll talk about how they understand these rules. And so we're going to use that surface structure. Surface structure is the words in the sentence. Remember, deep structure is the semantics, to figure out our syntax structure. So if we're building this parse tree, here are the rules we're going to use based on those surface words. Okay. These processes help people with memory load. So if I can neatly categorize each word, I have much more processing power left to do other things like create that semantic picture. Okay. So parsing is top down. We start at the beginning of a sentence and look 1 or 2 words ahead. Remember, because of foveal vision, we can only get so many things in our focus vision at once. And so we'll look 1 or 2 words ahead and we'll predict what constituent comes next. So we're expectancy generating what words we would expect next. Okay. By creating this parse tree, there's a right association. So new words on the right are attached to the lowest structure so far. So as we're building this sentence, the next rightmost word, because English is the right to left or left to right language, gets attached to the next little tree. Anytime we hit a function word, we're expecting a new phrase, and that creates new nodes on the tree, or new kind of branches on our tree. We can only cope with a couple of sentence nodes at once because of our processing limits. So anytime you have a sentence with embedded clauses, that gets very complicated, and your brain is just like, because we have working memory limits, and parse trees have those same kinds of limits. Closure, we will hope to close a phrase structure as soon as possible. So late closure is sometimes where you'll close a phrase structure kind of as quickly as possible, even if it isn't correct. So we expect the nouns and the verbs that are close together to be a phrase structure and to close them. Fixed structure, it is very difficult to get people to go back and reinterpret sentences. We don't like to go back and restructure things because of those clauses. And processing, so when we close a phrase, it goes from being syntax and work into all of the words and short-term memory into semantic processing. So it's kind of like you've said, here's this phrase, it's one big chunk. Here, you figure out what it means. I'm going to keep creating these syntactic chunks for you. Okay. And so sometimes that was called the sausage machine. It's a preliminary phrase packager. That is so hard to say. Preliminary phrase packager. So it takes these phrases, these rules that we just talked about, takes about 6 words and creates these little packages of syntax. And then sends that on to a sentence structure supervisor. And that's just rude, all of that alliteration. But that is what's constructing the phrase into the parsing tree. And so sort of like packaging them into little sausages was the idea. However, now this is all good and nice, and this is how we think people process sentences. The way that we can test these theories is by using ambiguity. So back to ambiguity again. So there's 2 models here. There's an autonomous, meaning syntax and semantics are separate, 2-stage model. And then there's going to be an interaction model. So we're going to talk about both of these and see what we think is correct. Okay. So in the autonomous 2-stage model, the first stage is syntax. So with ambiguity, we're going to take one representation and build it. And we're going to use 2 of Kimball's rules. Late closure. So any incoming material is added to that last phrase. So we're adding it to just whatever phrase is last, and we're closing it. Also, minimal attachment. This is about the newest node idea. The incoming material is attached with the fewest nodes. So we want a small number of nodes because of processing limits, and we're adding them at the end. Okay, so this garden path sentence implies that the first stage of syntax, we're building one representation, so it's serial, using late closure and minimal attachment. Okay. The second stage is when the themes come in, all the semantics. And so as semantics is going through the model that the syntax has built, if it doesn't make any sense, then we'll go back to stage one and try another version of the parse tree to send back to stage two. So stage two really is like a fact checker. When the facts are wrong, you send it back and kind of revise and resubmit. A second type of model is an interactive one-stage model. So these are called constraint-based models for ambiguity, where semantics creates these constraints on what is possible parse tree-wise. The theme and the discourse, the bigger picture, say, well, here are the only possible parse trees that you have that you could do, and the syntax creates the parse trees based on those constraints. So it's like a lot of the possible interpretations are eliminated because of semantics, because it doesn't work in this context. So some evidence for the autonomous-based models. So since J always jogs 1.5 miles, this seems like a very short distance to him. That is a late closure type of sentence where we make that this seems like a very short distance to him as a separate clause, right? And we add the very short distance thing to that sort of ambiguous noun, the this. Since J jogs 1.5 miles seems like a very short distance to him, now we've taken out the this. And so really the interpretation is, since J always jogs 1 mile, then the a half seems a very short distance to him. Like, you're trying to late close that and make those separate clauses, but it doesn't really work. The criminal confessed his sins harmed many people. We stick people, minimal attachment, while wise with the harmed situation. So semantic information doesn't seem to help with garden paths. So that's the evidence for autonomy. So that's what a lot of this is that we're trying to use late closure and minimal attachment and not base this on semantic information. So the defendant examined by the lawyer turned out to be unreliable. So the defendant is the unreliable one, but semantics-wise, either one could be unreliable, so semantics isn't helping here. Now, if I said the evidence examined by the lawyer turned out to be unreliable, now it seems much more sense that the evidence is unreliable, and it's the same basic sentence, but they are processed very differently, so semantic information is not really helping with these garden paths. So some evidence for autonomy, brain-wise, is that we can actually damage people's representations of semantics and syntax separately, so that implies they're separate things. Using EEGs, we can look at semantics using the N400, that is a negative waveform, 400 milliseconds after whatever you're looking at has been presented, whereas P600, which is a positive waveform, 600 milliseconds after you've seen something, to talk about syntax. And so semantics changes at the N400 peak, syntactic issues change at the 600 peak. So to look at these two things, we would actually see different effects. Because this garden path sentence, the defendant examined by the lawyer turned out to be unreliable. It's a garden path because we can't attach lawyer and turn together, right? We have to do turned out to be unreliable as part of the defendant, and the lawyer examined is the noun phrase, verb phrase. So it's a garden path because it leads you astray here, thinking that this is noun verb when really this by the lawyer is an embedded clause. However, evidence can't examine, so we don't create that picture. And so in this one you would see an issue with syntax, and in this one you would see an issue with in 400 semantics. Sorry, brain farted out there for a second. So Boris noticed the puncture and got out to change the wheel on the castle. You can get big spikes in the N400 because castles don't have wheels. And so you're expecting a very different word there. And then if you hear this sentence, Boris persuaded to fly, you get big P600s because you don't persuade to verb. Right? So we see differences in syntax and semantics, which argues that they're separate things. The cats won't bake the food that Mary leaves for them. That is a semantic effect because cats aren't baking normally. So you get these effects, these N400 spikes. The cats won't eating the food Mary leaves for them. That's a syntactic effect because eating is the wrong conjugation. Although semantically it does make sense. The cats won't baking the food that Mary leaves for them. That's both. So you'll see peaks for both of those. And so the argument is that this is a representational modularity, meaning that semantics and syntax are represented separately somehow in the brain. Processing modularity, though, is a different thing. So it does argue for autonomy in the fact that they're represented separately in the brain. We do see them activate different areas of the brain. But are they processed separately? So do they work together, or are they totally separate things? Okay. And so the autonomous model doesn't really differentiate between these. It says that they're separate things, but it sort of is, in theory, the model should argue that that processing occurs separately, but there isn't a whole lot of, there's support for both sides on this thing, but they do, there is support that they're represented separately. So they're different parts of the brain, but the question becomes then, do they work together or not? Okay. So there is a semantic bias. So the words in the sentence are going to bias phrase structure to create non-minimal attachment. So autonomous model argues you're going to do minimal attachment all the time, but we can actually bias you away from minimal attachment because of some semantic theme that's being presented. And so anytime we have a semantic violation, it creates this garden path. So the granite rocks during the earthquake. Granite is rock, but doesn't rock like shake. But if you said the table rocks during the earthquake, that's a legal sentence. So the granite rocks is sort of a semantic bias towards those being nouns, but then it isn't a noun. It's meant to be a verb, and so it creates this sort of garden path sentence because of that semantic violation. So generally, it's thought that we're creating a phrase structure word by word, syntactically, and we sort of have the strongest phrase structure possible as the best one. And then we're generating all of these other possible phrase structures, but they're being ruled out by context. So syntax is doing its thing, building this phrase structure, and semantics is actually disposing. So syntax composes, semantics disposes, or proposes and disposes. But semantics is ruling out some of these other possible options. Okay, so here's an example. The vampires loaned the money at low interest, were told to record their expenses. And now this is one that a complementizer would really help. So the vampires that were loaned the money at low interest were told to record their expenses. So loan the money at low interest is an embedded clause, but when we have vampires loaning money. I don't know why they love using the word vampires, but anyways. Loaning money, that creates a semantic expectation, but then once you hit the second word, you have to sort of back up. If you give people only vampires loaned money at low interest, we're told to record those sentences. That single word only completely disambiguates the sentence. And so that only argues that it's creating a semantic bias or context that rules out a lot of these other different phrase structures. Okay, so that implies an interaction between semantics and syntax that might work separately, but they're talking to each other. Okay. Some other evidence for interaction-based models, and you'll see this is probably going to be the one that's the most popular, is a verb bias. So we're looking at the possible verb interpretations, and the most frequent verb interpretation gets picked first. So that's a semantic bias towards the most frequent meaning option. Direct object verbs, so we're expecting something to come up next. So like the word gave, we're given gave what, so we're expecting a direct object, to whom, possibly an indirect object. And then sentence complement verbs, so there are verbs that don't need anything else, but we expect something else. So like I realize, and then you're left going, what? So you're expecting other things, but you don't have to have them. And so the idea is that it's a competition integration model. So the interpretation is checked after each new word, and so we've got syntax building and semantics checking, and kind of going back and forth. But we do have this problem called digging in. So if the ambiguity is not cleared up until further away, we don't really want to give up on the model we've already created. And so this is where late closure and minimal attachment are really important, because we're sort of like trucking along, we've built this structure and it makes sense, and then we hit that problematic section. And we want to just kind of attach it and not think about it. And so if it were only syntax and then semantics, we would just attach it and move on. But because they're working back and forth, syntax is like, let me just add it at the end, it'll be fine. Semantics is like, no, this makes no effing sense, we gotta go back. And so they're fighting at that point. So syntax has dug its heels in, and semantics has said, no, you need to do something else. Okay, so another example, after Martians invaded the town that the city bordered. Now that sentence is perfectly fine up to this point until you get was evacuated. So what's happening is after the Martians invaded the town was evacuated. Now the town that the city bordered. So that the city bordered is an embedded clause, but you aren't expecting the next verb sentence here. Okay. So some evidence for interaction in the brain. When you have an ambiguous sentence, you get more brain activation because this sort of semantics and syntax going back and forth. And what we kind of think happens is that in Broca's area, you get some syntactic representation. In Wernicke's area, you get semantic representation. Because remember, Broca's is what do I say next? So we're building the structure of it. Abstract thought is in the front of the brain. Wernicke's is, does this make sense? Okay. So which model is it? Is it an autonomous model or an interaction model? And I'd say that most of the research really supports an interaction model with some points of autonomy. So I don't think they're perfectly blended together. It's not just one big processing thing. It appears that they are separate entities in the brain. They do these things, they show different effects, but they're always on the phone with each other, chit-chatting about what's making sense and what's not making sense. So as I'm building my parse tree, it's just sort of checking in with semantics to make sure that this tree still makes sense.